Dr. Tatiana Paula da Cruz, thank you very much for joining our interview series. Let me start right away with the first question. Bolsonaro has been sentenced to 27 years for plotting a coup, the first time in Brazil's history that a president and military leaders involved in such an attempt have been convicted. How does this break with Brazil's tradition of impunity, and what does it reveal about the maturation of its democratic institutions?
So hi, everyone. Hi, Selcuk. Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here. So as you just said, this is the first time something like this happened in the history of Brazil. So it's a huge break in the impunity tradition. In the dictatorship, when the dictatorship ended, we didn't have a transitional justice. We didn't have generals trialed, no one convicted. So this created an idea that they were all above the law. And right now, this breaks with all of this, because now we have major military players convicted, and we also have a former president convicted of attempting a coup. So yeah, for me, this shows two things primarily. First is judicial independence. Our Supreme Court showed that they can and they will enforce the Constitution whenever needed. But I think the most important thing is that other institutions also matured. It's not just the Supreme Court a player in this case. We had the federal police, we had the federal prosecution, we had the court itself, and all of them were very interacting very well in order to get this outcome. And finally, I would say this is a cultural shift as well. The society is not willing to take such attacks on democracy anymore. So it's a huge moment for us.
Right. Justice Alexandre de Moraes meticulously built the case for over 2 years, defying Bolsonaro's claims of judicial persecution. From your perspective on judicial politics, does this verdict strengthen long-term trust in the Supreme Federal Court or risk deepening narratives of judicial dictatorship?
So I think this is the hard question that we are all asking right now, because I think it can cut both ways. If I were to bet, I would say that this will further trust in the Supreme Court. This will make the levels of trust higher and legitimacy higher as well, because it's another instance when the court shows that they can act under pressure. So COVID was the first instance for me in the short past. Just happened during COVID. Everyone in the high government was against the Supreme Court measures, and they could enforce the Constitution right there. And I think they did the same right now. And this shows to the population that they can count on the court to enforce the Constitution. But I think there might be a second possibility, because Justice Alexandre de Moraes was the face of this prosecution, the face of the inquiry and the conviction. And this is, in my opinion, this is bad for the court, because this personalizes such an important verdict in one person, which shouldn't be the case. The main verdict had the presence of other justices, for sure, but he was the one that became the face, the highly visible player in this case. And I think this can further arguments of judicial dictatorship, and this can play in a negative way. As I said, if I were to bet, I think this will be positive for the Supreme Court. I think population will see that the court is there, even when the government is not siding with them. But let's wait to see.
Right. Bolsonaro's conviction included charges of armed criminal conspiracy and attempted abolition of the democratic rule of law. How do these charges fit into the conceptual vocabulary of authoritarian populism? Are they an appropriate legal reflection of political subversion?
Yeah, I think they are. For me, this is one of the most important points here, also, because we could have had a conviction involving, let's say, opinion or public information that Bolsonaro gave. We could have a much more politicized trial, but the court decided to focus only on the facts that happened, and those facts were mainly about the armed conspiracy, the conspiracy involving an armed and a violent attempt against important political figures, for example, President Lula and Justice Alexandre de Moraes, and they focus on the plot coup. They didn't focus on things that would bring this idea of politicizing words or posts or whatever. They focus only on the coup. And this speaks very much to the idea of authoritarian populism. There is a threshold, there is a limit in which the society needs to say, this is not rhetoric anymore. This now is armed conflict. This now is constitutional subversion, and this we are not willing to take. And I think our court did this very well by applying the criminal code in the most legal way in that instance.
Right. Bolsonaro and his lawyers insist the trial was politically motivated, echoing populist claims of witch hunts. How should scholars distinguish between legitimate judicial accountability and lawfare in cases involving populist leaders?
I think if we can set an example from what happened in Brazil, the most important guarantee that courts should be paying attention to is due process. And this was what our Supreme Court did. So every time the defense is asked for information or whatever, they were allowed to, even though there is a huge argument that trying those people in the highest instance of the judiciary violates the defense right. The court had several precedents saying that this is not the case, and this was not the first case when people were tried in the Supreme Court, but all the due process observed in every step. And I think having this and stronger evidence, factual evidence, and witnesses that can, in our case, we had the whistleblower, for example, that can show that this is not a conspiracy, that this is not a witch hunt, but this is a actual trial that follows the due process and proportionality. I think that's the key. I think the key is to show that we are holding to the law and that the law allows for this punishment to happen.
The Supreme Court split 4-1, with Justice Luis Fux voting to absolve Bolsonaro on procedural grounds. Could such dissents provide legal ammunition for appeals? And more broadly, do fragmented judicial opinions undermine institutional legitimacy in high-stakes political trials?
I heard a lot and I read a lot about this during the last few weeks. And I side with the people who think that this is actually positive, this is actually beneficial for our democracy. By having a strong dissent like we had with Justice Fux, it actually shows that justices are allowed to think otherwise, that there were evidence, that there were arguments from the defense that would allow for justice to think otherwise, and that the court is not hunting someone at any cost. So I think this dissent actually shows that the court can dissent, that the court can have different arguments, and this is actually positive in a high court such as the Supreme Court. In terms of appeals, I don't think this is a huge problem here. We have a specific appeal that would be possible, opened, if this decision were a 3-2 decision. So if we had two justices siding with Bolsonaro, then he would have a specific appeal that would apply to this case. With only one dissent, this appeal is not applied. So I think this idea that it opens the ground for the defense to explore more possibilities of appeals, this doesn't apply in this case specifically. So I think this dissent, which in my point of view was too much of a long dissent. It took the entire day to read the entire vote, and it was much more procedural than based on evidence itself. But I think it plays in favor of the Supreme Court. And it shows that unexpectedly, someone dissented completely on the verdict. And this actually shows that the Supreme Court can have a debate. And this is positive.
Your research shows Bolsonaro strategically militarized bureaucracies while eroding public trust in the armed forces. How does the sentencing of senior officers alter Brazil's civil-military equilibrium, and could it delegitimize the armed forces as political actors?
Yeah, we always had this problem with civilian control over the military. Since the dictatorship, when the new constitution was drafted, there was so much power being given to the military that we could almost never say that they were not allowed to play a specific role. So, I mean, this, what I call the militarization of bureaucracy was a legal process. And this is the problem for me. So there were laws that allowed for the military to occupy primarily political positions. And I'm not just talking here about the Ministry of Health. There was a general. This is a political appointed position. It was super problematic. We never had active during military in such a high position like that, and it's questionable. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about very positions in all the levels of the political bureaucracy that were allowed to the military to occupy by law. So several changes in federal legislation allowed for military to serve up to 4 years, up to 6 years outside of military specific positions of the barricades and go to politically appointed positions. And Bolsonaro knew how to use this in his favor. So an unprecedented number of military occupied his bureaucracy, and this for sure set the basis for him to have the support he needed when the time came. So I think in order to rebuild the civilian control over the military here, much more is needed than just changing the Ministry of Defense and placing a civilian instead of a general. I think what is needed is a legal reform that really understands and really explains why, for example, we need a sergeant in the Ministry of Health. Why would it be important for us to have a soldier in the Ministry of Education? Why those things align? So I think that's the most important right now. We should be looking to the reason why those legislations allow people to leave the military functions and go to civilian occupations.
Bolsonaro's failed coup was partly foiled because top military commanders withheld support. Should this be read as evidence of institutional resilience or a sign of fractured loyalties within Brazil's security establishment?
I think it's actually both. If we had the Ministry of Defense plus the 3 commanders in Brazil, which in the US we would call the Secretary of Air Force, Secretary of Army and Navy, if we had all of them, plus the Ministry of Defense, the minister saying, no, we cannot side with this, I think this would be a strongest sign of resilience. But that's not what happened. So in this conviction, in the trial, we just had the conviction of the Ministry of Navy and of the Minister of Defense. Both of them sided with Bolsonaro very strongly, saying, we support you, we'll be by your side. And just the Ministry and just the Secretary of Army and the Secretary of Air Force said otherwise. So it's resilience, because 2 of the main players showed they don't want to compromise, they don't want to play completely political roles anymore, but it's also fracturing loyalties, because he managed to get out of 4, he managed to get 2 votes on his side. So the point here is to understand that he could have had all of them siding with him had he chosen the right commanders, let's say. So I think this is resilience, but this is always also fracturing loyalty, and that's the problem. If it's fracturing loyalty, it could have another outcome, and that's what we don't want. We want an institution that doesn't want to side with coups anymore at any cost.
Having served as a legal advisor in the Air Force, how do you assess the prospects of rebuilding robust civilian control in the defense sector after this episode of politicization and militarization?
Yeah, I guess I repeat myself a little bit, because with my experience, what I see is, like I said, there is a legal foundation, federal rules that allow for the military to serve outside of prominently military positions. So they can serve basically anywhere, as you can imagine. So you can have a military serving in the Ministry of Education. You can have a soldier serving in the Ministry of Construction or Agriculture in specific cases. And this, for me, is what takes the control over the military from the hands of civilians. Military should be serving in essentially military positions. We could question, for example, why do we have military serving in a superior military court? There you may think that they are needed, they can give an important view in the cases that are there, but we should have a civilian structure that can hold anything that is not completely military. And this civilian structure is fractured when you allow for the military to leave the barricades, to leave their military function and go to civilian positions. So we had military spread all over any civilian and public position you can imagine during Bolsonaro's government. And I think this is the biggest problem with civilian control. Like I said, it's much more than changing the Minister of Defense and placing a civilian in the Minister of Defense. We need a legal reformulation. We need a legal reform that really accounts for situations where the military can leave military function. This, in my point of view, is what should not be happening.
In your article on courts and democracy, you highlight how crises can paradoxically bolster judicial trust. Do you see Bolsonaro's conviction producing a similar crisis effect, strengthening institutional legitimacy, or will it reinforce distrust among his base?
Yeah, that's precisely correct. In my article, I analyzed this crisis effect during COVID. So when we had the federal government against the vaccination or against isolation measures, the court said no. We need here to give some autonomy for the municipalities, for states, so they can decide about their isolation measures, something that Bolsonaro said completely against. So in that moment, they said, we want to uphold the constitution, even though this goes against the president of Brazil in such a crisis. And this showed to be positive for the court. Population sided with the court because the court was willing to uphold the constitution in the middle of this crisis. And I think this can be precisely the case here right now. I think the population can, and if I'm correct, will, or if my hopes are correct, the population will recognize that even in the middle of such a pressure against the verdict, the court used the constitutional guarantees to rule and to uphold the constitution, even though the pressure on the streets, even though the pressure on Bolsonaro's side was otherwise. So I think this crisis effect might be happening here in the future anytime soon.
Trump has denounced Bolsonaro's conviction, raised tariffs, and framed the trial as a parallel to his own legal troubles. How might this US intervention reshape Brazil's democratic trajectory, and what does it reveal about transnational populist solidarity?
Yeah, so from now on, I think I must say I'm not a specialist in American politics. So I do Latin American politics all the time and mostly Brazilian politics. Here is my personal opinion. I think there is a transnational solidarity here among the leaders that face similar situations. But I also think in this specific case, there was a huge pressure from one of Bolsonaro's sons, a federal deputy, a congressist that lives here in the US right now and was feeding fake information to the US government. And because of this misinformation that was going on and this pressure towards siding with Bolsonaro, I think this was the main reason of the outcome, like raising tariffs, public speeches against the Supreme Court in Brazil, punishing Supreme Court judges with the visa revoking, etc. I think this major player, this congressist that is, let's say, irregular, without not completing his functions in the Congress and living here in the US, I think this was the major player in this huge mess that was around the verdict.
From a comparative perspective, what lessons does Brazil's trial of a former president and generals offer for other democracies facing populist challenges, such as the US, Israel, Turkey, or Hungary?
I think the best correlation we can do here is between Brazil, Turkey, and Hungary, because in these three cases, I would say Israel as well, because there was a major reformulation in the judicial system there. I think in those three cases where the system failed was to guarantee that the main organism to oversee the constitution had the independence they needed to do their job. So when a populist come and they cut every possible check that the court can do in the executive power, if this is allowed step by step, when you need the court to act, they cannot act anymore because they are not powerful. They are not a veto player anymore. And I think that has happened in those three cases. In Brazil, whenever Bolsonaro tried to impeach a judge or measures that would curb the court knew how to show this was not constitutional, this was not allowed, and knew how to fuel popular support against this type of measure. So the court knew how to remain legitimate, even though the pressure was high. In those other countries, I think the curbing was silent and was consistent up to a point that you couldn't undo it anymore. And when the court was needed, it wasn't really operational anymore.
Bolsonaro's rhetoric mirrors Trump's in portraying judicial accountability as elite persecution. Do you see Brazil's case as a model of democratic resilience, or does it risk setting a precedent where judicial overreach becomes a populist rallying cry?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a question I don't really have a good answer for right now, because I think this will take time for us to understand. What I can say is that internationally, what the public attention has portrayed about Brazil is that Brazil did what the US could not do, that Brazil did what the US Supreme Court could not do, and that Brazil is an example of resilience. And the main reason of this resilience, I will repeat myself again, is that we were able to keep judicial independence during all Bolsonaro's tenure, and he was not able to change the court in the way he did it. So the court remained independent. I think this is what we want to show to the world. Like, we had a populist leader. This populist leader tried attacking the court, but the court survived, and the court was able to uphold the constitution against this leader moments later. So I think this is the precedent we want to set. If this will create an idea of or a cry of judicial overreach, I think this is too soon to say right now. It sure can, and it probably will, but will this be stronger than the claim that the court was strong? I don't think so.
And lastly, Dr. Da Cruz, in the US, Trump floated deploying the National Guard in major cities under the guise of law and order. From your research on Brazil's bureaucratic militarization, what hidden agenda do you see behind such proposals? Are they about restoring order or normalizing military involvement in domestic politics?
Yeah, this is another question that I mean, I'm not the expert in American politics to say. So what I can say is about what happened in Brazil. The moment when we saw those numbers of military bureaucratization growing was the moment when we had the federal intervention in Rio de Janeiro. And from that federal intervention, when the military received in their hands the control over police in Rio de Janeiro because of claims of drugs and crime, etc., that we could not stop anymore. Years later came Bolsonaro and his Minister of Defense, that one day was the interventor in Rio de Janeiro. So every military politician tracks back to this intervention in the police in Rio de Janeiro that happens years before Bolsonaro's tenure. So when we decided to do this showed a shot against our democracy. So this is what I can say. Like, it's very problematic when you bring the military to issues and to problems that are not precisely for the military to handle.
Okay. Dr. Tatiana Paula da Cruz, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
I appreciate so much.